Thank you. Before I start my talk, I don't think I can begin without first saying what moving stories we've just heard. And the first thing I think is what an important field I'm working in. And it's a huge privilege to be standing here in New York, and thank you for that. I flew over yesterday from Cardiff. So, if I can get the slides going. Is it? Can we get the next slide? Okay, that's great. So I flew over from Cardiff yesterday. This is our building. I think it's pretty miraculous the photographer managed to get this picture. The sky is, we're famous for our rain, so this was a big feat getting a blue sky. The reason I'm showing you my building that I work in is upstairs we have our offices and labs, and downstairs we have clinics, and this is my clinic room where I see children. And so my research journey has been shaped by not just research, but also by being heavily engaged in clinical practice. And in doing this talk, I thought I would do it. There's a number of different ways I could do it, and I thought what I would do is give you an insight into the search for causes of ADHD, but I'm going to do it from a personal and historical perspective. So let me go back to 1990. In 1990, I was working as a full-time clinician and as a trainee child and adolescent psychiatrist working in publicly funded the UK NHS child psychiatry clinics. And one of the things that we have to do in clinical practice is always take a family history. And of course, you can't help but fail to observe clustering of different disorders in families. And so this raised the first question to me in clinical practice. Do genes actually contribute to child psychopathology? And even at this time, the 1990s, people were still talking about, well, this disorder is caused by poor mothering or some sort of belief about that. And we really didn't know much about whether genes contributed to psychopathology. And so my first research was actually conducting twin studies to look at the genetic contribution to childhood psychiatric disorders such as depression and ADHD. And what we found is that actually ADHD came out as very strongly genetically influenced, highly heritable, between 76 and 90% heritable. And it wasn't just coming out from our own study, it came out from studies across the world showing this to be a very consistent finding. What we then later found is, because we wanted to look at different types of ADHD, is that there was a subtype of ADHD which was accompanied by extreme behavioral disturbance or aggression that seemed to be particularly strongly familial and heritable. And we found that in 2001. Given the very strong genetic influence on ADHD, the next logical step, so going back to 1997, was to ask what sorts of genes were involved at a molecular level. Could we get some understanding of the biology of ADHD? And the way that one does that, we've already heard about it today, is pretty straightforward. You have a sample of people with ADHD, individuals affected with ADHD, and people without ADHD. And we compare patterns of DNA in those with ADHD versus those without. But what's really changed since 1997, and is actually changing all the time, is the way we characterize DNA patterns, and we can define people's genetic variation. And because of technology, that has just been revolutionized over time. So I'm going to talk about two types of genetic variations. The first one is what we call common gene variants. So, as people will know, DNA, we all have a DNA, we have a code, these are the bases, and at some of these locations, we show differences between each other, and these are called variants. And what we look at is single nucleotide differences or single nucleotide polymorphisms. Geneticists, we like to call them SNPs. Now, in terms of looking at comparing those with ADHD versus those without, any one of these just has a very small effect, and that's true for all complex disorders and psychiatric disorders. However, what we can do is put all these risk alleles together into some sort of composite, so you can add them up together. You don't just look at one. And what we found then is in 2012, when you look at them together and the top alleles, that ADHD common risk, there were some risk alleles that predicted ADHD in different samples. And what we found, which was interesting given that's what we had hypothesized given the twin findings, is that those common genetic risk alleles were particularly enriched in those with the most severe subtype of ADHD who had the most aggressive behavior. What we also found is that what we notice in clinic and in practice is that, of course, ADHD, although it's defined by very extreme, severe overactivity, impulsiveness, and concentration difficulties that are present across multiple settings, that actually there are deficits that extend far beyond diagnostic criteria, and we need to be mindful of that. And actually, we know that children with ADHD have other sorts of difficulties. And what we found, and this is just a paper that's just come out in 2014, is that when we take that composite of ADHD risk alleles, that in the population, in an independent population, they predict poorer abilities in terms of social language ability and communication problems, and also poorer learning ability affecting IQ and working memory. Working memory is kind of a bit like computer RAM. It's how much sort of information you can hold at any time. So it seemed to affect these multiple domains, suggesting that genes were working on ADHD, which was behaving more like a spectrum. So I've talked about the SNPs, the common type of gene variants. The second class of gene variations I'm going to talk about are what are called copy number variants, and these are subtle chromosomal anomalies. So two types that I'm going to be talking about are where we've got chunks of DNA that are extra duplicated, DNA duplications, or where you've got chunks of DNA that are missing, these are deletions. So going back to 2010, we looked at children with ADHD, a sample with ADHD versus those without, and found that they carried much more of large, rare deletions and duplications, chunks of DNA missing and extra. What was really interesting as well is that the regions of the chromosome that were carrying these deletions and duplications showed significant overlap with the same regions that had been implicated in autism and schizophrenia, highlighting the neurodevelopmental origins of ADHD. So genetics is very interesting, and it's really important in terms of course, trying to understand more about the biological mechanisms and the pathogenesis. But we also want to get, ultimately we want to get clues about new treatments. And I want to highlight that actually genetics, as well as giving clues about biological mechanisms, can give clues about psychological mechanisms as well. So again, I'm going to go back in time. So now I'm going to go back to 2005. Now at that time, we couldn't look at DNA variation across the whole genome. We were reliant on picking specific candidate genes. And we became very interested in a gene encoding an enzyme called catechol-O-methyltransferase, COMT. This is an enzyme that's very important because it clears dopamine, a brain transmitter, and it's the primary mechanism by which it breaks down this neurotransmitter in the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. In the gene that codes for this enzyme, there are different varieties of this gene, and this variation basically affects how fast the enzyme works. So some people have a fast version and some people have a slow version. So this high activity version of this gene, they clear dopamine much faster from the front part of their brain. And groups of researchers working in brain function and imaging had suggested that this particular gene variant was linked, especially those with a fast, high activity version, was linked to poorer planning and control, and secondly, also to emotional processes. So at that time, we were interested because we knew that the group of children with ADHD, and particularly severe behavioural disturbance, were in extreme form. We looked at the severe behavioural disturbance in the children with ADHD according to their COMT, that genotype. And those with the fast version indeed showed a much higher level of behavioural disturbance. Now, whilst this was interesting back in 2005, in science you have to be cautious, particularly at that time. You could have picked lots of different genes. So until you get replication, you're not confident about these findings. However, we had colleagues who then contacted us and said, look, we found exactly the same in a big cohort in New Zealand and in London. Then we also found the same in colleagues in Bristol and also in the States. So with these replications, we come to the next question. Well, you've got a genetic finding. How do you get from gene to what you actually see clinically, that severe disturbance, that severe subtype of ADHD? And we were lucky here in as much as there had been a lot of cognitive and imaging work done on this gene variant. And so we could hypothesize there were two potential routes. It could be through the poor planning control route that we call executive function, or it could be through the emotional or affective route, because both those had been shown to be related to this gene variant. So we tested those as possible ways that you get from gene to what you see behaviourally. And we looked at a large population cohort in the UK and tested this. And what we found, as we might have expected, is, given previous findings, this gene variant predicted poorer planning and control, measures of executive function. It also predicted measures of impaired emotional understanding. But actually, the link to the severe subtype of ADHD was mediated partially through the impaired emotional route, not through the executive function. So this was interesting, but again, you'll have picked up, I'm always cautious until you look more and you look more closely, you want to remain cautious. But this was very interesting because we don't often look at emotions and emotional function and processes in ADHD. We're very focused on the cognitive aspects. So what we've done most recently, and this brings us up to 2014, so this is what we've been doing in the last 2 to 3 years. We brought back the study I just told you about was a big UK population cohort. We've now brought in the clinic children with ADHD, 200, in for very detailed laboratory testing, where we did lots of tests looking at their planning and control, measures of executive function. And we also looked at emotional processes much more carefully. We looked at how children did in terms of feeling other people's emotions, what we call emotional empathy, and also looking at fear learning, how well they would learn from kind of stimuli that would create fear, and we assess this by measuring their sweat levels. And what we found is that the same gene variant, again, predicted poorer planning, control, impaired executive function. It also predicted aspects of emotion, and what we found that the emotional processes when we use tasks actually seem to be encompassing ones involving fear. So these children with this fast gene variant just didn't seem to really pick up or respond to other people's fear or learn from fear, and it was through this that the link was with the severe ADHD subtype. And actually, most of the current treatments assume that this is intact standard approaches, and we don't actually look at this when we're providing treatment. So, going back to the twin studies, one thing we know is that ADHD is not purely genetic, wasn't 100% heritable. And I'm interested in how genes and environment work together. So the question is, which environmental risk factors contribute to ADHD? Well, ADHD, by definition, is an early onset disorder. It's there in early childhood. So these risk factors have to be operating early in development. So the prenatal period, when children are in the womb, that's of particular interest in relation to these early onset neurodevelopmental disorders. So focusing on work looking at the prenatal period, we and many others found that children exposed to cigarette smoke whilst in uterine life showed increased rates of ADHD. And this was shown across multiple studies. And in fact, this was a paper we published, and then we put all the studies together and showed that for babies exposed to cigarette smoke in utero, the rate of ADHD was double that if they didn't. So we believed around that time that mothers smoking in pregnancy caused ADHD. But as a scientist, you have to be dispassionate. Although that's what it looked like, you really have to attempt to disprove your hypothesis if you really want to show it's robust. So then I turned to the next part of our journey. Why were we concerned that this might not really be a definite cause? Well, we know that smoking in pregnancy has adverse effects on the growing fetus. And so most mothers will be told to give up, or they will give up smoking. So the ones who can't give up in pregnancy, it's not random. So we know that not being able to give up smoking, there's a strong genetic contribution. So was it that maternal smoking in pregnancy was resulting in children's ADHD because it was exposure to nicotine in the womb, exposure to carbon monoxide, or the smoking disrupting placental blood flow? It was a real cause. Or is it actually mother's genes which are contributing to her smoking in pregnancy, being passed on to the child, and then manifesting as ADHD? And it's for this reason one wants to be cautious about thinking that smoking necessarily causes ADHD. What we'd like to do is remove that genetic link so you can test whether that's there. So how would we do that? Well, we were very fortunate, myself, with colleagues. We thought, well, one of the things you would want to do is actually to be able to adopt away a child in the womb. And actually, that you can do that because one natural sort of experiment is where, through assisted conception or IVF, where the child can be genetically unrelated to the woman undergoing the pregnancy. So that's the design we used in the UK, and we hypothesized that if maternal smoking in pregnancy really is a real cause and has real risk effects on the child's ADHD, it won't matter if the child is genetically related or unrelated to the mother or the woman undergoing the pregnancy. What did we find? Well, we found, as one would expect, maternal smoking in pregnancy wasn't good for children's health. Didn't matter whether the children were genetically related or unrelated, it predicted lower birth weight. So there are compelling reasons you shouldn't smoke in pregnancy. However, is stopping smoking in pregnancy going to reduce rates of ADHD? I'm not sure it does, because what we found is that the link just wasn't there if they were unrelated, suggesting that actually the link that had been observed in previous studies was perhaps due to a genetic link and not due to a true cause. What about family life? Well, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I see children with their families. And one thing that families ask, and actually students ask, is ADHD caused by family stress? You know, and I sometimes get students saying this, oh, everyone is very stressed. Was ADHD caused by that? And we know that for antisocial behavior, parenting, family relationships do impact on antisocial behavior. But ADHD is not the same as antisocial behavior. So you have to test that. You can't make assumptions. And this is where science comes in. You can't base it on opinions. What we've done, using longitudinal research, and there's other people who've done treatment studies to look at this. And what we found, and others have shown as well, is that actually what was being seen in clinic was a consequence of the ADHD symptoms in the child. So the ADHD symptoms in the child was impacting on the quality of relationships with others. So suggesting it's a consequence, not a cause. And most recently, we've undertaken a study looking at 500 children who were adopted away at birth. And what we found is that the genetic risk and their very early features of ADHD predicted how the adoptive mothers seemed to be behaving or seemed to be responding to the child. Again, highlighting that the ADHD features were having an impact on relationships. So an important thing, just because you observe two things going together does not mean that one is a cause of the other. And actually here, these were ADHD effects rather than a cause. And that has important implications, not just in terms of public understanding and family understanding, but also in terms of thinking about ways of early intervention and prevention. So, in terms of causes of ADHD, I've described a journey, and what we found, and others have found, is that ADHD, there is a very strong genetic contribution, and we showed that very early on using traditional observational designs with twins. We found, since the 1990s, common and rare DNA variants contribute to ADHD, and how ADHD is closely related and shows close overlap with other neurodevelopmental disorders. For anyone who sees patients in clinic, they'll know that there are lots of clinical overlaps. Actually, there is a biological overlap as well. I hope I've highlighted that genes clearly can provide clues on biological mechanisms, and that's important in terms of thinking about therapeutics. But they can also provide clues on potential psychological or cognitive targets for future interventions. And as I've said before, certainly for the childhood neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism, we don't often think about emotional processes. And the environment, clearly for these sorts of disorders, they're not entirely explained by genes, but it's not straightforward identifying what are the environmental causes, and it's important to make sure that we know that they're causes and test that rigorously if we're really going to have something that's going to make a difference. But we need much more work on what environmental factors are causes and actually what modifies the longer term course. And I think we've made a lot of progress in the last few years, and I'm sure we will in years to come. Thank you very much.